I think if you want to talk with folks at NYU or university, you're not going to quit doing that. Especially with NYU, there's several people who have an interest in doing
Good afternoon and welcome back to the University of Pennsylvania Alice Paul Center Symposium on Muslim Masculinities. I'm Rabani Garg and I'll be chairing the second session. It's titled Masculinities, Violence and Affective Economies. The panel has 4 scholars and I'll briefly introduce each speaker. Starting the panel, our first speaker is Dr. Fatima Sidat, all the way from South Africa. And you can see her online. Can you hear me? Yeah. Her areas of focus are the gendered impacts of religion, tradition, custom, and law. She writes against a backdrop of Islamophobia and militarized Muslim masculinity. Her publications theorize the convergence of Islam and feminism through a decolonial reading of both intellectual paradigms. Second, we'll have Dr. Joshua Roos from Australia Catholic University. He's a political sociologist. He examines Islam in Western context, political Islam, Sharia and legal pluralism, multiculturalism, and citizenship. Then we have Dr. Natalie Kurito. She's a lecturer in the Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies program at the University of Pittsburgh. Her research focuses on solidarity between the global North and the Middle East under conditions of war and state violence with a focus on queer activism. And our final speaker for the day, we're very excited to have her here, is Dr. Mariam Durrani, who's an alumni of UPenn and is at Hamilton College now. She focuses on Muslim youth and communities. Her current book project examines the category of Muslim youth through an ethnographic study of migration, mobility, and aspiration among Pakistani-origin Muslim college students. Each panelist will have about 20 minutes, and then we'll have Ramya Srinivasan from the University of Pennsylvania discuss the scholar's work. It'll be followed by an open Q&A, and I'll provide each of you with a heads up at 2 minutes, and then 1 minute, and then finally when it ends. We'll get started. We'll start with you, Dr. Sidat. Can you hear us?
Okay, you'll just have to speak a little louder because I can't hear very well here.
Okay, so we'll start with you.
Should I start?
Yes, please.
Begin with sharing the PowerPoint. There you go. So the first thing to do is to say thank you for this invitation to present this paper. And thank you too for making possible a presentation from South Africa. Lots of people like international travel. I have lots of wonderful friends in North America, but I'm really happy when I don't have to travel to the US from South Africa. I'm glad that I can still participate without having to travel. So what I'd like to do to bring to the table is a discussion on the forms of masculinity produced through Islamist practices of sexual enslavement. And the 2 points of significance in this discussion for me are the forms of masculinity that are produced in Islamist discourses and the ways in which modern technologies of the body are co-opted in Islamist enslavement practices. Finally, if I have time, what challenges these practices present for non-Islamist and non-militant discourses on sexuality. I'd like to begin with the statement of one American general, George Patton. He's also known as Bandito, Old Blood and Guts, the old man, known to be someone who led from the front and also known for his speeches filled with vulgarity. And I beg your pardon here before I quote one of his speeches in explaining the link between war and its sexual economy. He said, very succinctly and very aptly of his troops, if they don't fuck, they don't fight. And so he made a very definitive link between the prosecution of the war effort and the sexual activity of the combatant. That's a picture of him. That's a picture from a movie that was made about him in the 70s. But he's not our focus. Our focus is pattern statement, which formulates the combatant's sexuality at the intersections of penetration of the body and military combat, producing what I call a hypermasculinity that necessitates the supply and availability of sex for combatants. And the violent nature of war means that this sex may be either solicited formally or enforced violently. In the production of concubines for the Baghdadi Caliphate, ISIS and other Islamist militants that practice sexual enslavement argue that they are simply reviving a historic practice, in fact, maintaining a historic norm. What is the origin of this narrative, which centers on the hypersexual and the militarized Muslim militant in control of the sexual other through the institution of forms of female sex slavery, justified as a practice of war? Are these simple reenactments of the past, or is this a production of contemporary forms of militarism and sexuality? My analysis of the ways in which this is done suggests that through the apparent reenactment of the historical in the present time, what I refer to as a historical present, this produces a contemporary narrative of Islam, which is centered on the intersection of militarism and sexuality, mediated through modern sexual technologies and reliant on operations of Muslim piety that locate epistemic privilege in historical tradition. I argue first that the discourse of Islamist militarism, such as that of ISIS and Boko Haram, produces a modern Muslim militarized masculinity through a historical present that revives the figure of the Jariya, or the female slave. Now, Fatima Mernissi, way back in 1996, argued that the Jariya is central to the political memory of the historic Abbasid Caliphate. For scholars of Muslim women's history, therefore, it's not surprising that the narrative of enslaved women is central to the narrative of al-Baghdadi's caliphate under ISIS. Mernissi offers a pressing analysis of the treatment of sex difference in Islamic thought and the location of female slavery in Muslim political memory. The third period of Islamic history, which she associates with the Abbasids, she characterizes as the period of the Jawari, whose figure dominates narratives of women's marginal status in later Islamic political thought. The Abbasid era is characterized by the often accomplished slave women, captured in Muslim conquest across the empire, who begin their lives notoriously as slaves, but end in prominence as mothers of caliphs. The popular narrative of the subjugated feminine, Mernissi argues, is best traced to this period, where the ensuing cult of courtesans in political memory reflects our nostalgia for absolutism. So how predictable, then, to see in the contemporary revival of the caliphate the simultaneous revival of the Jariya, representative of male fantasies and stories inspired from the days of imperial Islam. It is as though in the production of Yazidi concubines and Chibok captive wives, and I put wives into scare quotes, is the militarists' imagining of the caliphate made complete as it is, simultaneously also made both historical and contemporary. Islamist militants appear to draw upon two narratives in the context of sex slavery. The first is the political narrative explained by Mernissi's argument on the place of the Jariya in political memory, which combines the memory of the subjugated feminine and nostalgia for territorial absolutism. This is a mythical narrative of a Muslim past where the caliph controlled both his territory and his women. The second narrative Islamist militants appear to draw upon comes from nationalist understandings of masculinity shaped in the protection of the nation, its women, and tradition from colonial others. And so my suggestion is that in the sexual economy of Islamist militarism, the imperatives of the caliphate and the nation-state combine. And in the operations of religion, war, and sexuality, groups such as ISIS and Boko Haram produce a masculinity that is located dually in the historical absolutism that accompanies the political memory of the Jariya of the caliphate, and in the militarized freedom fighter or savior of Islam who upholds the sovereignty of the post-colonial nation-state. While the narratives of Islamist militarism that conflate the caliphate and the nation-state to widely different political formations may appear to be conceptually anomalous, Both offer congruous methods for the control of territory and women's sexuality. The modern readings of law and technologies for managing sexual production are illustrated, sexual reproduction in the nation state are illustrated in 3 documents on slavery produced by ISIS. The first is a fatwa. The second is a question and answer publication titled Questions and Answers on Captives and Slaves, produced by ISIS Ministry of Research and Legal Opinion in November 2014. And the third is an ISIS newsletter called Dabik, and I look at issue 4, produced in October 2014. Now, presented just a month before the legal manual, the newsletter, Dabik includes a 3-page entry, The Revival of Slavery Before the Hour, where Yazidis present a problem of legal definition. Questions are they non-Muslim or Muslim apostates? Resolving on the former, the article explains the legalities of their enslavement through a direct link between the practice of enslaving Yazidi women and the nearing of the hour, signaling the end of times evident in the revival of slavery. Its abandonment having occasioned various forms of immorality. The connection between the revival of slavery and the end of times is drawn through a hadith or prophetic tradition. That one of the signs of the hour is that the slave girl gives birth to her master. This is reported by Al-Bukhari and Muslim on the authority of Abu Huraira and by Muslim on the authority of Omar. Now, it may be well known amongst some of us here that the laws of enslavement determine that a slave woman who gives birth to her owner's child is released from the slave trade, in that she may remain a slave, but may not be traded again, and her child is considered free. The child has legal status of the father and inherits from the father. The resultant status of Walad, a slave mother of a child of a free father, is a form of release from slavery, since the law renders the Walad free on the death of her owner. Now, contrary to this historical practice, amongst the narratives that have emerged from escaped Yazidi women is that slavery in the Caliphate is marked by meticulous contraceptive practices. The stories of escaped women indicate that combatants ensure that women do not become pregnant by using various forms of forced contraception. One woman describes how she was forced to take contraceptive pills under the supervision of her owner. Others have recounted similar experiences of forced contraception, pressure to terminate pregnancies, and there's also an instance of forced termination. Because pregnancy implies a woman may no longer be traded, some women interviewed by the New York Times, for example, said that they knew they were being sold when they were driven to a hospital to give a urine sample to be tested for the HCG hormone, whose presence indicates pregnancy. They awaited their results with apprehension. A positive result would mean that they were carrying their abuser's child. A negative result would allow Islamic State fighters to continue raping them. The absence of pregnancy keeps the woman in circulation as a slave and avoids their potential legal freedom from slavery. A classical law on slavery also requires that a woman traded between two owners observe a period of abstinence to establish pregnancy or its absence, and therewith paternity, referred to as establishing the emptiness of the womb, such that the sale of a pregnant woman is invalid. Instead, enforced contraception and testing for pregnancy hormone ensures the absence of pregnancy in ways that were not possible in earlier times and restricted under classical law. Primarily, it allows the owner to trade women without the interim waiting period. Though unsanctioned, historical slavery practices were not without similar manipulations, reflected in literature on induced miscarriage and contraception, which allowed slave owners to avoid the legal consequences of pregnancy in slave women. What is unique now is the modern-day efficacy of these sexual technologies of the body. Without the possibility of an interim period of abstinence between owners and the possibility of freedom through pregnancy, the results of ISIS trade in women is a particularly modern form of concubinage that allows the management of women's reproduction through contemporary contraceptive practices, including pregnancy tests, contraceptive injections, contraceptive pills, and safe terminations, facilitated by the efficacy of these technologies. Therefore, while Dabik first argues for re-establishing slavery as an indication of the end of times and a necessary aspect of belief, ISIS practices slavery through uniquely contemporary sexual technologies of the body. Amongst them are the free market trade in reliable contraception, the reliable testing for pregnancy, and the safe termination of pregnancy. The efficacy of these technologies rendered their application particularly useful in controlling the sexual labor of a captive slave woman and the strict management of her sexual reproduction. A further uniquely contemporary aspect is the way the historical law on slavery is invoked in terms of the affordability of marriage and issues of domestic work. In Darbeck, there is an article which explains that a number of contemporary scholars have mentioned that the desertion of slavery had led to an increase in fahisha because the Sharia alternative to marriage is not available. So a man cannot afford temptation towards sin. In addition, many Muslim families have hired maids to work at their homes face the fitna of prohibited khalwa and result in zina occurring between the man and whereas if she were his concubine, this relationship would be legal. And I'll stop reading that quote there. Whereas historically, war captivity allowed for enslavement as a means of sexual subjugation, Darbeck suggests enslavement as a means of addressing the needs of poor men who cannot afford to marry. The article argues that those who cannot afford the ordinary cost of a dower may either go to war to secure a concubine as booty, or they may rather afford the cost of a concubine, and further, that a concubine may serve better than a domestic worker. Whether this is how slavery actually worked in classical times is known to some extent, in that the texts often suggest the first option, which is marrying a slave woman in case a man cannot afford the dower for a free woman, the two being historically different. The distinction between marrying a slave woman and making war with the intent of making women concubines is indeed significant, in that the Quranic injunction on slavery does not suggest enslaving women in order to make licit sex more affordable. This is a different and a novel motivation for war, in that it argues for enslaving women as war captives in order to facilitate the sexual needs of poor women. The Darbeck article also indicates a lack of knowledge about the historical legalities of the practice of concubinage amongst ordinary combatants. While a concubine may also have been required to offer domestic services, a slave purchased for domestic services could not be automatically expected to also provide sexual service. So, for example, the slave woman of a wife may not be expected to provide sexual services for her owner's husband. Her sexual service would need to be negotiated through her owner. While historical texts suggest a clear distinction between domestic service and sexual service, the manuals often refer to concubines as jariya, as Mernisi does, or as sariya. The author here seems to make no similar distinction in this Darbeck article. Instead, the author sees domestic and sexual services interchangeably, and that is likely true for most ISIS fighters too. This is, first, a present-day reading of the practice, which is built onto actual experience of the practice to build upon, and second, it's evident that the historical laws of slavery are also not common knowledge amongst ISIS military. And so to conclude, while historical laws produce a system of sexual slavery that includes possibilities for emancipation, ISIS enactment of sex slavery uses forced contraception and termination to ensure that enslaved women can never release themselves from slavery through pregnancy. Neither is there the opportunity for reprieve between slave owners. Instead, slave women are passed between slave owners without the historical requirement for a period of time in which to confirm a woman is not pregnant. The easy availability and high levels of efficacy of oral and injectable contraception mean that slave owners can enforce contraception on the women they own, manage their fertility, and deny it as they choose. Sexuality managed in these ways does not find easy resonance outside of militarized Muslim communities either, where believers struggle with the implication of sex with a concubine. And to look at this, I looked at some online fatwas. And there I found that petitioners in online fatwa sites inquired about the consent of the concubine, the danger and the requirement to fulfill a wife's needs in the presence of a concubine. These questions were couched in the framework of a rights-based argument. And these concerns jar against the sensibilities of the militarized Islamists who see Yazidi women as a reward for their war efforts, or military organizers who use globally normative military practice to ensure the supply of sex in the provision of war. The impossibility of release from sex slavery through historical guarantees is accompanied by the dissonance between concubinage as a contemporary form of illicit sexuality and common understandings of sexuality in marriage. While the historical legal paradigm of marriage is sexual control, the common understanding of marriage reflected in the non-military fatwas that I reviewed suggests that partners view sex in terms of mutuality, consent, responsibility to full desires. ISIS formulations of sex slavery in their military efforts are therefore aberrant both to historical sex slavery and to understandings of sexuality. While wholly violative, it is not, however, and this is important to note, they are not, however, aberrant to the ways in which sex is otherwise factored into the general economy of war, where colonial and neo-colonial war efforts are orchestrated in ways that formulate the supply of women's sexuality into a commodity under control of the military. And I have a lot more about the ways in which that has happened historically and presently in the article that I'm drawing from for this. But I'd like to conclude here.
Do I need to wait for him to be online? Dr. Roos, you can start now. Can you hear us? Yeah. All right. Yeah.
Okay, just confirming you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you. You can start anytime.
Sorry, so, yep, I can start. Excellent.
Yes.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Shanila, for organising this. It's exciting to be joining you at 4 a.m. From Melbourne. I'd like to start by taking you through, well, this is really a chapter of my book. I'll get stuck in. The challenge of Western-born and raised young Muslim men leaving their homelands to fight with the Islamic State movement in Iraq and Syria has been well documented in the media and in reports by think tanks. Such reports typically focus on the number of recruits, their apparently disproportionate role in committing atrocity, and the dangers of their potential return. However, comparatively very little work has been undertaken to explore the central role of masculinities in shaping recruitment. This paper explores this issue with a particular focus on the Australian context. Australia has produced the highest per capita contribution of foreign fighters to the Islamic State movement alongside Belgium. And it was announced in April 2017 that up to 400 Australians were on a Turkish terrorism watch list. Why Australia? Why is it in a country that is noted for its success as a multicultural nation is this occurring? With a particular focus on the intersection of masculinity, emotion and violence, this paper reveals how Islamic State narratives have been skillfully tailored to exploit key fault lines in the formation of masculinity amongst Australian and Western Muslim men, and considers some potential responses, policy responses to address this challenge. It is my argument that this notion of the Islamic State provides an alternate source of meaning, honourable recognition, redemption, empowerment and belonging. For young Westerners, joining the Islamic State offers them the opportunity to overcome one or more of past humiliation, shame, guilt, grief and injury. It reinforces a wounded masculine pride. Before I begin, I should make it clear that a majority of my own work has been focused on the success of Muslim communities, not only integrating after initial migration, but thriving as citizens irrespective of cultural difference. For example, in research informing an article for the Journal of Youth Studies, I've looked at, with Anita Harris, I've looked at how a religion-inflected moral citizenship shaped positive participation in wider society. However, it's also important to look at the flip side. Stories of discrimination and racism directed towards Muslim women wearing visible markers of identity such as the hijab or burqa abound. These are very often public acts directed at humiliation, though accentuated by violence, such as attempting to rip off an item of clothing. However, much more difficult to explore has been the hidden racism, leading to a sense of alienation, anxiety, enemy and anger amongst young Muslim men, particularly those of the second generation. There is a definite sense of subordination and amongst some, emasculation in the face of constant scrutiny and a silencing of dissent. And this drew me to masculinity as a concept that has, until relatively recently, been overlooked in exploring the current role of social and political circumstances. Masculinity studies cannot be done in isolation from an acknowledgement of the experience and role of women in shaping them. However, exploring them in isolation does yield important points for consideration. The concept of masculinity offers, in particular, considerable promise to exploring the question of how social influences shape political action by Muslim men, allowing us to move beyond stereotypes to understand the complex nature of practice. In outlining the fluid nature of masculinity, Connell has noted there is abundant evidence that masculinities are multiple, with internal complexities and even contradictions. McDowell makes a further important observation that class and ethnicity combine as a major factor in the social construction of masculinity, interacting with gender and generation to produce varied and unequally valued positionalities, which in themselves are both complex and fluid. There's a tendency to overdo Connell's work in masculinities around hegemonic masculinity, but I think it's particularly important in the Australian context where the original studies were derived. In a re-evaluation of the text 10 years after its publication, Connell and Messerschmitt explain the difference between hegemonic and subordinated masculinities. She notes that hegemonic masculinity was distinguished from other masculinities, especially subordinated masculinities. Hegemonic masculinity was not assumed to be normal in the statistical sense because only a minority of men might enact it, but it was certainly normative. It embodied the currently most honoured way of being a man, required all other men to position themselves in relation to it, and it ideologically legitimated the global subordination of women to men. Whilst acknowledging the concept requires development, for example, engaging with the manner in which subordinated masculinities shape hegemonic masculinities, this provides an important frame for engaging with how subordinated status shapes social behaviour and political action. In the Australian context, hegemonic masculinity is commonly regarded to be a white Australian male. White has argued that the manifestation of this in Australia is the Australian lifesaver, the embodiment of a three-way relationship between masculinity, whiteness and the beach. Though this may equally be applied to the boardrooms of Australia and government agencies where white men continue to dominate. There's also other dimensions. There's a hard edge, there's a stoicism, a lack of vulnerability, no outward displays of emotion. It is in this context that Ghassan Haj's framing of misinterpolation is particularly valuable. Young Australian-born Muslims are promised that all the rights and opportunities of Australian citizenship are open to them. Yet for many, particularly those from more socioeconomically marginalised backgrounds, experiences of silent racism and apparent roadblocks to upward mobility cause what Haj terms a shattering of the myth of belonging. For these young men, there is an alienation from mainstream Australian society and a sense of emasculation and subordination. Subordinated masculinity, particularly amongst the most disempowered young Muslim men, is viewed as performative, emphasising a hypermasculinity through displays of physicality and toughness, i.e. the photo on the right. Based on research with young Lebanese men in Sydney, Greg Noble considers that these displays are the result of a lack of honourable recognition and a lack of respect from wider society. Noble draws on Connell's notion of protest masculinity to describe the manner in which this emphasised masculinity captures the ways their emphasised masculine style works as compensation for the hidden injuries of class and race, recuperating a sense of dignity. It is argued that this form of masculinity bound them together and defined them against those who withheld respect from them and in doing so injured them. Humphrey takes incidents of injury as moments of crisis that challenge self-identity and cultural life. The actual instant at which the injury is received may be considered a pivotal moment for identity construction, where cultural meaning is up for grabs. And this is key. There's an extreme emotion and an unwillingness to feel vulnerable and disempowered, and this shapes extreme action. Young Muslim men, due to the intensity of the focus upon their very existence, could be considered very likely to bear the emotional scars of a society that simultaneously demands their integration and conformity to dominant white Australian values, yet still discriminates on many levels. The case of Western foreign fighters adds a layer of complexity to understanding the issue of alienation, despair and anger amongst the working class and underclass due to a variety of factors, including religious motivation. However, it's important to consider why young men might be so alienated from their own country that they might take up arms against it at home or elsewhere. For the purpose of brevity, I'll cut through the slides and summarise them. These are available to anyone who's interested. So the Australian Muslim population is growing exponentially. It's more than doubled in the last decade alone. Australian-born Muslims are the single largest group, with 70% of Australian-born Muslims under the age of 20. Muslims on average, particularly amongst the overseas-born, have high levels of tertiary education and are increasingly moving into the professional class, and yet are still overrepresented in unskilled jobs. Muslims have lower average incomes and are significantly more likely to live in poverty than the wider community. They're also less likely to own their own homes. So we're seeing a cleavage in amongst Australian Muslim communities between those doing well and those struggling to make ends meet. Having considered the statistical factors, I do now want to consider the macro-political factors shaping participation. Before doing so, I want to consider the approach of Pinker, who's argued in Better Angels of Our Nature, the myth that violence is caused by a deficit of morality and justice. He argues that, on the contrary, violence is often caused by a surfeit of morality and justice, at least as conceived in the mind of the perpetrator. Western foreign fighters and those that support them view their battle as moral and just, and to violently critique them feeds into their narrative of victimisation. It is vital to immerse oneself in the worldview of Islamists, and particularly young Western men leaving to fight with the Islamic State movement. The following representations are focused on the Australian experience and our media, but could probably broadly be considered applicable worldwide. What I ask you to do is to consider, as an observant Muslim, the sheer multitude of times that Islam has come into question and Muslims are condemned on the basis of their faith. This list is by no means complete, but if you immerse yourself in the imagery, the humiliation, pain and suffering of Muslims, what I'm not showing here are the images of dead children and grief-stricken parents that predominate on the significant amount of social media traffic, and particularly on some of these websites. Viewing these as a researcher, you feel not only physically sick, but emotionally drained, angry and saddened. It's easy in this context to imagine the notion of a war with Islam. It is easy then to consider the helplessness and disempowerment that one caught in this might feel. When combined with broader social dislocation and downward social trajectories, this constitutes an affront to the masculinity and sense of manhood of some young men. The Islamic State narrative provides an alternate source of meaning, honourable recognition, empowerment, redemption and belonging. This photo is actually used in propaganda. Couldn't make this up. It offers young men the opportunity to overcome not only this past humiliation, shame, guilt, grief or injury, but offers them an alternate source of empowerment that they're not getting from participation in wider society. I've transcribed some recruitment videos, including Australians. I think the first is English. Zakaria Rad is an Australian. And if you look at the words that are highlighted in black and in red, note the contrastive terminology. You have no honour, depression and disgrace are contrasted with words in red signifying belonging and redemption. My brothers, we feel happiness, light, love, honour, your family, your wife. Ultraviolence in this frame now becomes associated with love. The language utilised, depression, no honour and disgrace, captured perfectly the alienation, anxiety, anger and sense of humiliation that those working class men voting for Trump or supporting Brexit vote might feel. It is garbed in an Islamic Salafi jihadist cloak. The narrative offers redemption, honour and empowerment, a renewed sense of masculinity and self-worth. Eulogies are a key mechanism by which Islamic State fighters are venerated in the eyes of potential supporters to emphasise their masculinity and virility in the face of impotence and powerlessness. Eulogies celebrate the dead as brothers, lions, mountains, true men, as honourable, racing towards heaven's a common trope, knights, heroes, and even commando knights. Izzat Raad is an Australian foreign fighter. Just by way of background, he lost his brother to cancer at the age of 23, and this was a key catalyst in his attraction to jihadism. He completed his high school studies and was a qualified electrician, but was also involved in rebirthing stolen cars. He became involved with the Ben Brika Jama, Australia's first convicted terrorist organisation, and was imprisoned aged 24 for terrorism offences. Upon his release, he snuck out of Australia to fight, and as it turns out, die with the Islamic State movement. His eulogy in the Rumiyah magazine reads as follows. I won't go into it all, but again, if you look at the words in red, he's described as the embodiment of triumph, bloodied, dismembered and radiant. He's a chivalrous mujahid, as opposed to being who refused to be subjugated by the shackles of humiliation. You know, he wielded weapons of faith and honour in defiance of the Kafir masses. So again, the contrastive language is pivotal and provides an insight into the mindset and experiences of many of these young men. That Raad, a petty criminal with no future in his country of origin, is represented in medieval terms as chivalrous and noble and strong, speaks to not only the strategy employed by Islamic State recruiters, but speaks to its resonance. I'm going to, unfortunately, in the interest of timing, I am going to cut through these case studies, but these are young Australian men pictured here who've gone off to fight and die, either in Syria or in failed attacks within Australia. You have here Jake Bellardi, Newman Hayder, and Adam Darman. And you can effectively see that these are just kids, and yet they've been drawn to this narrative. The case studies are outlined in the book, but they signify in many ways the role of emotion. They all have really powerful stories of immense grief at the loss of a loved one or a relationship, a shame or a guilt due to their participation in certain activities, and a humiliation in the hands of their or the treatment at the hands of authorities or their classmates or others. So the paper's made the following points: that the Islamic State narrative provides an alternate source of meaning, recognition, empowerment, redemption and belonging. And for young Westerners, joining the Islamic State offers them the opportunity to overcome this past humiliation, shame, guilt and so on. The same narrative offers a chance for revenge, an essential element of suicide bombing and atrocity that is arguably more important than altruism. Masculinity is central here. I argue that we're seeing a new form of resistance masculinity, a powerful yet internalised anger and capacity to quite literally explode in rage against figures of authority and hegemonic identity. And a key here is that more work is needed to be done to help young men manage emotion, including grief, despair and powerlessness. There's also got to be more work done to incorporate success stories into counter narratives of belonging, particularly in multicultural contexts. And to that extent, hope, belief and upward social trajectory are vital. If you just look down at government efforts to shape Islam, I mean, there's been so much work and focus on engaging with imams councils and so on, but in many ways these are irrelevant. These men were marginalised by their own communities in the first instance. More work is needed to be done to incorporate traditional Islamic education with critical engagement with text. Attempts to profile based on physical appearance are absolutely redundant. And as a future research agenda, the role of women in shaping these men is not adequately understood and needs to be engaged with further. All right, I'll call it there. All right, thank you.
All right, let me see if I can just reorganize this. Can you hear me if I speak this way? Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me here, for allowing me to share my work. Shanila, thank you for the invitation. It's such a wonderful and exciting opportunity to be in conversation and dialogue with some incredible scholarship. And so my paper is called Killing Children, Honor Crimes, and Queer Masculinity in the Making of War. And I want to just start with a quote by Judith Butler: "What politically might be made of grief besides a cry for war?" On July 2nd, 2014, the body of 16-year-old Mohammed Abu Khader was found near Jerusalem. Burned alive, his death came on the heels of the discovery of the bodies of 3 Israeli teens, Eyal Yifra, Gilad Shahar, and Naftali Franco, who were kidnapped and killed on June 12th by suspected rogue members of Hamas. Rumors soon circulated in the Israeli press and on social media that Mohammed was gay and that his death may have been the result of an honor killing, as photographs of the boy were posted online with the caption, "The Arabs killed him for being gay." Investigations later confirmed, however, that he had been abducted, tortured, and killed by Jewish extremists and not his family. Looking back at the days leading up to Operation Protective Edge, also known as the 2014 Gaza War, Israel's longest war in Gaza to date, which began on July 8th, 2014. The honor killing rumor may seem inconsequential, especially given the wave of international grief and outrage over the death toll of 495 Palestinian children killed in Gaza that summer, and epitomized in the video footage of 4 children killed on the beach while playing. And this image really shook the international community. Why focus on a rumor about one boy who was murdered by civilians before the war even started, when hundreds of other Palestinian children were killed in the ensuing weeks? Although the murders of these teenagers in 2014 did not themselves instigate the war in a direct way, their deaths nevertheless framed the discursive landscape that preluded the war, as the language of national security was drawn upon in Israeli society in public outcry over the murders of the 3 Jewish teens. In the sentencing of Hussam Kawashme, the man convicted of planning the kidnapping and murder of the 3 Israeli teens, the presiding judge noted that, and I quote, "The accused left indescribable damage in his wake and changed the lives of 3 families, mothers and fathers who lost their sons. Direct harm was caused to society as a whole and on the security arena, led to a wave of arrests and changed the security situation. The kidnapping was like an earthquake which shook the region," end quote. The judge's statement is instructive here. It is not only that the murders shook the family or public sentiment over children's lives, it shook the region over the security situation. Following suit, I want to examine the relationship between national security and public grief over the killing of children. What role do children's deaths play in the making of war? And not only that, but I also want to ask the question of what happens with the teenage boy as a figure between the space of childhood and adulthood. So I turned to the 2014 case to investigate the interwoven dimensions of national security, honor crime, pinkwashing, Arab and Muslim masculinities, and childhood in the political landscapes of war and the international responses to things like war, like in the 2014 war. In particular, I'm interested in thinking through how the framing of the child and childhood innocence in particular shapes public sympathy and grievability of children killed in the name of nationalism and the nation state. For instance, in my previous work on the case of Omar Khadr, the Canadian teen who was held in Guantanamo Bay for over a decade, I have examined how Khadr's framing in the Canadian public deployed his innocence based on his status as a child, while his guilt was deployed through the incommensurability of his status as a child, in particular through the way in which his guilt was deployed in relation to Arab masculinity and Muslim masculinity as an adolescent, that imagined that there was no such thing as you couldn't see this person as a child per se. So he was a child terrorist, AKA an adult in the making. Adolescence, a stage in between childhood and adulthood, is an interesting place to look at how Arab and Muslim masculinities are deployed, and in particular, how the lives and deaths of teenage boys in particular are wrapped up in larger circumstances surrounding national security. Taking up Ayel Gross's framing of Abu Khdeir's murder in the context of another case of teens killed in Israel in 2009, I want to look comparatively at how children's deaths and how adolescents in particular stage grievability and legitimize war in the shaping of adolescent Muslim and Arab masculinities. In an opinion piece written for Haaretz, Israeli legal professor Ayel Gross argues that the circulation of the honor-killing rumor in Mohammed Abu Khdeir's death is an example of pinkwashing. Pinkwashing is a concept that's introduced by activists working in the Queer Palestine Solidarity movement, and wherein they argue that pinkwashing is a kind of similar function to whitewashing or greenwashing, which describes the way that rights and justice discourses are redeployed to serve hegemonic interests. So in this case, the use of gay rights discourses in order to promote the interests of a nation state or corporations sometimes is the other kind of place that we see that happening. In the case of Israeli pinkwashing, sexuality is used as an instrument in the battle of public relations, particularly in the Israeli state's deployment of gay-friendly marketing and advertising projects as part of the Brand Israel campaign launched in 2005. Mobilizing sexuality, gay tourism and consumerism, and sexual rights discourses such as legal recognition of gay rights, pinkwashing in this case becomes an integral part of the public relations war that has been directed, or that has directed Israeli foreign relations in the 21st century predominantly. So in the task, the new version of war strategy is to win the hearts and minds of the international community for the Israeli state, using these kinds of models and examples. So aimed at cleaning up Israel's international image, which has been tarnished by war, occupation, and human rights violations, this rebranding project recasts the state in the civilizational and developmental narratives of neoliberal modernity. So in particular, we look at consumerism through things like export industries, energy, science, and technology innovations through research and development partnerships with transnational corporations, governments, and universities, arts and culture through a robust program to fund Israeli artists and cultural producers to travel abroad as ambassadors for the Israeli state, and also the Israeli Foreign Ministry's funding for partnerships with arts and cultural events in international venues and communities. So we often see international festivals in the world, like film festivals, co-sponsored by the Israeli Foreign Ministry. In addition to also the marketing of the cosmopolitanism of Israeli society, predominantly represented in images of Tel Aviv through the gay nightlife and gay beaches. So Ayel Gross's assessment of the role of pinkwashing in Israeli responses to Abu Khdeir's murder compares this case to the public refusal to interpret a 2009 case of the murder of two teenagers, Israeli teenagers, at a bar in Bar Noir, which is like a kind of LGBTIQ space in Tel Aviv. And Gross argues that this is evidence then of a pervasive homophobia in Israel. In the refusal to read the homophobia of Israeli society in 2009 and the kind of hyper-focus on Palestinian homophobia in 2014, Gross argues that the charge of homophobia more generally is being mobilized in the interests of bolstering domestic nationalism in Israel. If Israel is liberal and democratic, then cases of homophobic crimes by Israelis must be motivated by individual rather than societal causes, whereas honor killing, by contrast, depicted as cultural, racial, religiously motivated, is necessarily communal violence. So in these two different cases in two different ways, we see, the similar kinds of acts of murder, one imagined as an individual pathology of criminality, and the other cultural and embedded in a kind of racial, cultural, religious discourse around violence. Dana Olwan, in her work on honor crime, argues that in the Canadian context, and I mean, I've got a lot of reference to Canada because I'm from Canada, so just to give context, the focus on the foreign nature of these crimes helps bolster notions of cultural superiority and redraw the civilizational line between inherently violent and barbaric Muslim East kind of narratives and the kind of democratic, gender equal, nonviolent, secular West. As Olwan demonstrates, the designation of an honor killing serves to locate gender and sexuality-based violence within the racial and cultural tropes of the other, while establishing the Canadian national context as a landscape where women are safe and free. The distinction between individual and communal violence plays a significant role in connecting gender and sexuality-based violence to the nation state in the period prior to 2014 in the ensuing war, in the Gaza war. So while the case of Bar Noir in 2009 and these murders, homophobic violence was individualized, which Gross argues preserve the nation state through a revival of nationalism as people in Israel came together to call for the support of protecting children and gay children in particular. In the case of the honor crime rumor, Abu Khader's death was collectivized in Palestinian society, and his death was not seen as something worthy of public empathy by Israeli society. So this framing was further fueled by the depictions, in particular the Palestinian men who killed the 3 Israeli teens earlier in June, as enacting not simply an individual act of violence on these children, but an attack on society as a whole, in the words of the judge, that shook the region. And that larger national collectivization of the impact of murder and death of children, I think, is really important here. So in Grosch's work on the Bar Noir murder, the wave of national mourning following the 2009 murder serves to posit the nation as itself the victim of hate perpetrated by an act of individual revenge. So in this case, Israeli society for Grosch is not itself homophobic and to blame, but rather the nation state that's gay welcoming has been hurt by the homophobia of this one act, the individual act. Rather than understanding the kind of complicit, pervasive conditions that shape actually the large-scale ways in which homophobia is actually quite active in Israeli society, and this is Grosch's argument. Conversely, when acts of violence are marked by cultural difference, we find a narrative, and as we find in narratives of honor killing, each case of violence is evidence of the communal nature of cultural violence. In both cases, the interplay across multiple social factors in framing violence is obscured as murder is either individualized or reduced to cultural relativism. So one of the things I want to propose is that the circulation of the honor killing rumor itself in 2014 played a part in staging Israeli public endorsement for the war that was going to start just a couple days later in the name of national defense. So the combination of public mourning over the murders of 3 Israeli teens and the vilification of Palestinian culture as inherently homophobic provided both reason and justification for militarized force in Gaza, both to protect the innocence of Israeli children who are seen as potential victims of the future threats of Palestinians. And in particular, this was really deployed in a kind of controversial tweet that the current Minister of Justice, Ayelet Saked, kind of retweeted this quote from an Israeli poet and writer and novelist who makes this like really disturbing analogy around how Palestinians are all snakes and their children are snakes. And the implication of the tweet was that Palestinian children are future terrorists, and therefore we have to eradicate all Palestinian children, because and it was incredibly controversial when it happened, especially in the international community. At the time, she was simply a member of the Knesset, and she's since been promoted to Minister of Justice. So just to kind of give a context for what happens in the lead up to war. For Judith Butler, the practice of dehumanization is not simply discursive. Dehumanization emerges at the limits of discursive life, limits established through prohibition and foreclosure. So in the days leading up to the 2014 war, the rumor that Mohammed Abu Khader was murdered through honor crime foreclosed the possibility of collective grief and structured public consent over war, wherein 30% of casualties in that war were children. By highlighting the story of the honor killing rumor, I'm proposing that the emergence of pinkwashing as a discursive practice used to uphold the state is much more insidious than simply a tactic of diversion. So it's not just that we're drawing attention away from a violation, we're actually producing the ways in which we can understand the intelligibility of victimization. So pinkwashing becomes then not only a way to celebrate the Israeli nation state, but it becomes a function that legitimizes 21st century state violence. Following the confirmation that Mohammed's killers were in fact Jewish Israelis, public discourse shifted to explain the attack on him and his murder as a revenge plot, a revenge narrative to retaliate against the murder of these 3 Israeli teens. So their deaths are directly connected in the larger discursive narrative in Israeli society, which again individualized the act of violence of the Israeli perpetrators rather than considering the role of national conflict and war in shaping this kind of model of vigilante crime that shapes and structures the murder and death in this case. So public consent for war was not the only possible outcome of the deaths of all of these boys, not just of the Palestinian boy, but the 3 Israeli teenagers. Judith Butler argues that there are other passages available through grief than military violence and retribution. Another response to their deaths could have emerged in the aftermath of all four murders, one that witnessed nationalist revenge play out and extended the public mourning of the 3 deaths of the Israeli teens to the Palestinian teen, to understand, the effects and brutality of, nationalist conflicts on the lives of children. However, such an extension of empathy was foreclosed precisely through the interconnected discourses of civilizational and racial divides in the honor crime framing, as well as the national security discourses that were constructed in the way in which we see in the judge's language the idea that the murders shook the national security landscape. Despite the quotidian narratives of death that frame life in the Palestine-Israel conflict, examining the logics of pinkwashing at play in the honor killing rumor reveal important considerations for thinking about the problem of war and violence. In previous work, I've examined how pinkwashing functions discursively in demarcating neoliberal narratives of modernity and bolstering the nation state as a kind of sovereign figure. However, as I argue above, pinkwashing discourses also become themselves tools of public dehumanization used not only to legitimize violence, but also to foreclose the possibility or ability to recognize life. In the neoliberal reformulation of Orientalist discourses that renew civilizational mandates for colonial violence in what Judith Butler calls, Jezbir Pura calls homonational times, pinkwashing serves as a discursive mechanism that facilitates the dissociation of Palestinian life and licenses military violence at the larger scale public civil society level. So despite reigning logics that construct the deaths of children as scenes for public and collective grief, the 2014 case raises important questions over the limits of how children's lives are rendered grievable and intelligible, and in particular, how masculinity renders a child's death as an innocent death. So in the case of Abu Khader, queer or effeminate masculinity, and his image circulated, and he looks very young, he looks very petite. We don't know what his sexuality is actually, but in that circulation of this rumor that he was a victim of an honor crime because he was gay, we see his innocence played out through his sexuality in this kind of pinkwashing rhetoric that posits his subjectivity within a clash of civilizational conflicts, when in fact, the narrative from his family is that he was loved and a member of the family, not exiled. And in fact, just a couple weeks later, his cousin, who's an American citizen, was beaten up at a demonstration for protesting his murder and the trial surrounding his murder. So we have this version of innocent life that is managed through his subjectivity as effeminate masculinity, as effeminate or queer subjectivity, and then that is completely foreclosed once we move on to this kind of civilizational divide, wherein all Palestinian children under this kind of racist and Orientalist rhetoric become the basis of potential terrorists in the making. And this is one of the main narratives that we see then making permissible, for instance, the large-scale number of deaths of children within Israeli society without regard for the, whatever generalized values that we might see within global human rights discourses around the sanctity of childhood innocence. So beyond the question of how we might recuperate the capacity to empathize in the pace of dehumanization, I want to ask how children's lives are rendered unintelligible in the first place. Which children get to be innocent? Who's framed as a perpetrator of violence or as a threat to national security? And how do national and international or transnational responses to these scenes of violence illustrate fundamental contradictions in the narratives we have about children and their deaths? When I first began this project, I approached the case to question I approached the case of children's deaths, in 2014 by calling for a return to grievability around the figure of the child. But I actually have come to question this impulse. And in particular, the work of Hannah Dyer and Dina Georgis on this similar situation where they examine the narratives around the foreclosure of children's play in the deaths of Palestinian children during the 2014 Gaza war. So in particular, they look at the narratives of international outrage over how children were killed while playing, so the children killed while playing soccer, and how the inability to play anymore is seen as also a second act of trauma for children, that they'll never be able to overcome the traumatic experiences of war if they don't have space to play. And in their work in particular, they argue that in reality, neither child nor adult are actually innocent or completely responsible for the conditions that bring about their pain. And so the turn towards childhood innocence is a turn that evacuates the child of agency around the capacity, for instance, to have anger. So we can imagine that children should be allowed to have anger around their experiences in war trauma because children are imagined to be innocent, unable to express anger. So to find common ground in the figure of the child, as Lee Edelman's work on childhood futurity suggests, is an insidious project wherein the desire to secure justice in the future of the child renders a quote, notional freedom more highly valued than the actuality of freedom itself. And so I want to really challenge myself to think about how the turn towards the child as a figure is taken up. So in this way, childhood is an interesting place to consider how life and death are framed in the projects of war, not simply as a site of innocence, but a place where the intelligibility of life and death themselves are produced. So to conclude, I just want to hint at 3 questions on the future of this research. And I timed myself for like the shorter end of it with a larger panel, so I'll end early. So the first is, how is adolescence a transitory space that renders the innocence of Muslim and Arab masculinities intelligible or unintelligible? So how is it that this idea of adulthood and childhood, how are they being negotiated? How is the figure of, in particular, the Arab and Muslim boy, especially the teenage boy, a kind of transitory space where we map on a ton of ideas around security, risk, violence, cultural intelligibility, desire, gender, sexuality, etc. The second question is, how is adult Arab and Muslim masculinity embroiled in the markings of innocence that are actually about adolescence? So how is it that Arab and Muslim boys and their boyhoods are actually a key feature of how we imagine the future and also the present of threatening Arab adult or Muslim adult figures? And I mean, I think Joshua's work is actually really a great example of this, in the sense that the tracing and the desire to trace narratives of adolescent trauma or childhood trauma to explain terrorism is, I think, one of the key ways that we see that playing out. And I'm really excited to read his work and his book. And then the third question is really about how the scenes, such as those of the war in 2014, in these kinds of places, what alternative narratives are we capable of finding, or can we construct as a response that goes beyond a call towards the innocence of childhood? So how can we see adolescent boys who are Muslim or Arab in such a way that doesn't simply rely on the constant insistence that they're innocent children, and gives them some form of agency? Especially since, as Dyer and Georgius argue, the myth of innocence, which cannot tolerate the child's capacity for complex or unsavory responses to violence, such as rage or aggression, never serves the child profoundly at all. And positioned in a binary with the adult's non-innocence is always potentially harmful to the traumatized adult. And so I really want to take these questions as I develop the project further. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna get started. Hello, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. I wanted to first say thank you to Shanila for inviting me. This invitation is mediatized by social media. And I also want to say thank you to the way the panel has been organized. I've never been on a panel with people on 3 different continents speaking about this issue, which is really fantastic. And also, I'm very happy to be back at Penn in a very different capacity, which is very exciting. I have friends in the audience. My mentor, Stan, is in the audience, so this is really great. So my paper is titled Constructing the Terrorist Monster in the News, Muslim Masculinities and Mediatized Culture Talk. The absolute linking of Islam and extremist violence circulates across news media sources, and often the gendered representative of a violent and irrational Islam is depicted through the figure of the Muslim man. To see how Muslim masculinity is projected in the context of anti-Muslim discourse, this paper analyzes a search on Breitbart News, a well-known conservative news website, using the search terms Muslim man and Muslim men. My analysis follows a similar approach done by linguistic anthropologist Jane Hill, where she analyzed internet search results to study mock Spanish terms and understand how English speakers encounter a lexicon that produces particular colloquialisms and reinforces negative stereotypes of Spanish speakers. My focus is not about the veracity of the news reports, but rather I'm interested in the kinds of culture talk about Muslim men one is likely to come across on these well-known right-wing online news sites, and I'm being generous calling it news, that have been gaining popularity as real news compared to the fake news that is prominent on more mainstream news platforms. With the increase in anti-Muslim hate crimes during 2015 and 2016, oh, yes, sorry, okay. So with the increase in anti-Muslim hate crimes during 2015 and 2016, the Southern Poverty Law Center argues that the exploitation by right-wing groups and political figures around the world have very likely fueled anti-Muslim hatred. Similarly, a study done by the Center for the Study on Hate and Extremism out of CSU San Bernardino found that the current president's tweets have a correlation to the multiple spikes in anti-Muslim hate crimes over the last 2 years. So I will first focus on the ways that discourse concerning American security from terrorism are indicative of dog whistle politics or as a kind of indirect speech. While the talk is most explicitly about American safety and security, the threat to security is foreign, terrorist or potential terrorist, and most significantly marked as Muslim and male. The official policies that accompany this kind of talk are collectively instantiations of structural Islamophobia or anti-Muslim structural racism, solidifying this form of racism in the public sphere. This shift in discourse is particularly notable since the US had very similar policies under the Obama administration, but the discourse about Muslims from the then administration was not as pointedly antagonistic or criminalizing. I then go on to analyze the ways that talk about culture or culture talk draws on gender and consider why this analytic feature may be obfuscated by an analysis or an emphasis on other kinds of identity talk. Specifically drawing on linguistic anthropology to interrogate the ways that stereotypes are produced and circulated, we can begin to see how mainstream gendered stereotypes about Muslims are organized and reinscribed across communicative events such as official policies, official discourses, and the news media. Beginning with an example of official policy, a prominent example occurred during the early period of the current president's tenure. Issued as Executive Order 13769, the travel ban was titled, quote, "Protecting the Nation from Foreign Terrorist Entry into the United States." Oh, this is too far. Oh, no. Okay. This is not the correct presentation. So I will continue. In his February 2017 address, he defended his travel ban on citizens from 7 majority Muslim countries. Trump stated, quote, "I will never forget that my responsibility is to keep you, the American people, safe and free." Who are these American people, one might ask? One might also ask if the millions of Muslim Americans are included or excluded from Trump's idea of who counts as an American. Furthermore, Trump's emphasis on keeping Americans safe and free, but from whom? And an example of how this policy is taken up in public discourse is found in Rudy Giuliani's interview with Fox News about the travel ban when he responded to the host's question about how the 7 countries were decided upon by saying, quote, "I'll tell you the whole history of it. So when Trump first announced it, he said Muslim ban. He called me up. He said, put a commission together, show me the right way to do it legally." Such statements, whether true or not, about current anti-Muslim immigration policies demonstrate how the current administration's conflation of Muslim with foreign and terrorist is repeated across news media platforms and thus regimented into public discourse. In these examples, we see how discourse about keeping Americans safe and protecting the nation is also a discourse that implicitly indexes Muslims as not American enough or even just not American, as well as a threat from which the other Americans need protection. The intertextual links between the executive order's title, Trump's weekly address, and Giuliani's interview on Fox News demonstrate the regimentation whereby the Muslim slot, here occupied by immigrants from Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen, are perceived as representing a real and immediate danger to America. Commentators and critics of the travel ban have repeatedly pointed it out, such as in Baidoun's work, quote, "The Muslim ban rubber stamps the embedded idea that terrorism is exclusive to Islam and regardless of one's legal status, exposes bona fide and imagined Muslims to the attacks of hate mongers that take the law into their own hands." When such generalizations are then recirculated in the news, politics, and popular culture, an emergent racializing discourse about the gendered Muslim subject comes into view. The pervasiveness of anti-Muslim discourse is obviated when talk about Muslims focuses on linking Islam to concerns about security and terrorism and forms this culture talk concept, which is concealing the racializing effect of such discourse. As with other racializing discourses, the covert nature of Islamophobia allows for racializing practices to continue behind what's been called a mask of plausible deniability. It's just about security, and we all want to be safe, right? In the second half of my paper, I will illustrate how gender is a constitutive element and how such racializing discourses or culture talk about Muslim personhood circulate and are reanimated across news events. Within this racialized discourse, the gendered character of the Muslim subject is often assumed and sometimes under-theorized. Framing the construction of the Muslim subject exclusively around race makes unclear how gendered bodies facilitate this narrative, positioning women, for example, as passive subjects at best and as oppressed victims at worst. Zilla Eisenstein has argued that while ethnic violence may be understood via blood-kin relations, it is enacted in and through gender. Similarly, while rhetorically anti-Muslim racism is understood through culture talk that links Islam to terrorism, materially it relies on the gendered body as a site where this linking takes place. The significance of this reliance on gender has life and death consequences for men. For example, for men and women. But for example, in 2015, Muslim men in the United States were twice as likely to be victims of physical assault and 5 to 6 times more likely to be victims of murder as compared to their female counterparts. To further interrogate how race and gender intersect in contemporary discourse on Muslims, I draw on Asif Agha's semiotic framework of large and small scales of personhood. I'm not concerned with what people here Muslims are really like, but rather, as Agha explains, I'm interested in how they are perceived as, quote, certain figures of personhood modeled and maintained by mediatized institutions in contemporary society. I focus here on how Muslim figures of personhood are maintained and managed by the news media, specifically the alt-right English-speaking media platforms. Through the term figures of personhood, Agha refers to situated performable behaviors that link social personae of a population. These behaviors, as well as certain phenotypic cues, mark individuals that we're concerned with here as Muslim. When a person performs these behaviors, even partially, such as having a dark-haired beard, it indexes a certain social persona and popular circulating images about him. However, these behaviors can then be detached from the particular case when such behaviors or signs are reevaluated and become recognized as a generic symbol for a social persona, moving from the small scale to the large-scale model of personhood. Once the figure of personhood is abstracted from the contingent performance, it can be reanalyzed as a decontextualized depiction. In this analysis about the masculinized Muslim subject, I'm concerned with not just the process of abstraction and reanalysis, but just who is being abstracted, by whom, and how. By exploring these questions, we can begin to see how dominant stereotypes about Muslims men are organized by gender and then reinscribed. The dominant narrative of the Muslim body has been naturalized as male, migrant, and potential terrorist. In these models of personhood, the Muslim male body is deemed both inextricably foreign and dangerous. The linking again between Islam and extremist violence circulates across news media, and often the gendered representative is the Muslim man. To explore how Muslim masculinity is projected in this discourse, I conducted a search on Breitbart News, a well-known conservative news website, using the term Muslim men. And to emphasize, obviously, Breitbart's well-known influence, its chief executive chairman, Bannon, served as White House chief strategist during the first 8 months of the administration. Furthermore, a Pew Research study found that 11% of Trump voters rely exclusively on Breitbart News as their news source. Here I focus on the first 10 pages of search results, and on this slide, the red-framed headlines specifically connected Muslim men to some kind of violent and sexualized crime. These headlines link Muslim man with a verb that describes a violent sexual crime against some girl or woman, either a female Muslim relative or young white girls. Other stories depicted here show Muslim men as violent troublemakers in Western countries. Muslim man sues Little Caesars for $100 million for serving him pork pepperoni. Muslim man charged brandishing guns outside Christian church. Police commissioner says young Muslim men shit on Germany. The title about Little Caesars focuses on a widely understood religious doctrine, focuses on or relies on a widely misunderstood religious doctrine such as the prohibition of pork. In another two examples, not on this slide, I found, quote, men only swimming at public Luton pool, quote, a cultural thing, which talks about segregated swimming activities, and, quote, Ramadan rage, Muslim who ran down 5 men with his van praised as good family man by judge. So talking about Ramadan fasting in this context. Echoing from earlier, my purpose here is not about the veracity of these news reports, but about what this kind of culture talk does when, about the kinds of culture talk about Muslim men one is likely to come across on these extremely well-known sites that have been gaining popularity and who claim themselves to be representing a kind of direct speech. The explicit framing of Muslim men as sexually deviant and even incestuous appears often in the comments section of these news stories, where readers describe Muslim men as Neanderthals, pigs, vermin, and other pejorative and xenophobic insults. These negative stereotypes and offensive racist descriptions often connect the news story in question as representative of Muslim men, reinforcing the danger that Muslim men present to women and the larger American public, a threat which must even be banned. While this may be seen by some readers as extreme, the power of such racist speech must not be underestimated in its ability to echo structural Islamophobia. As Beydoun explains in his book, dialectical Islamophobia connects the individual level racism with structural and systematic kinds of racism, such that the larger public comes to view Muslim men, all Muslim men, as terrorist monsters. In these titles, there is often no other identifying marker other than Muslim. For example, it is a Muslim man in Norway rather than a Norwegian man. Muslim and man are the sole identificatory labels. In these titles, Muslim men are not only perceived through their religious identity and immigrant status as violent non-Westerners, but they are also viewed through their gendered identity and assumed sexual identity as prone to rape and sexual violence against women. Notably, these news stories emphasize that Muslim men are not raping other men, but young women and girls, even their own daughters. Puar and Rai describe how such invocations of terrorist monsters reinscribe how, quote, an absolute morality separates good from shadowy evil. Quite literally, Muslim men are perceived as hypersexualized terrorist monsters with no moral compass, capable of violent acts and beyond exoneration. Muslim masculinity here is indexical of potential violence and danger, and indirectly indexical of the danger that all Muslims represent. As a contrast, I also searched Christian man, and here are the article titles that popped up. Pakistani police strip Christian man naked, beat him to death with logs. Syrian Islamists defecate in church, light Christian man on fire. Pakistani Muslim men kill Christian girl for rejecting them. Alexandria man slits throat of Christian alcohol retailer. In these examples, the category of Christian is positioned as the direct object of the sentences, as the receiver of the violence initiated by a Muslim man. In other words, the Christian subject is a victim of the Muslim subject in a kind of Crusades-era style discourse in the 21st century. The gendered aspect is indirectly assigned given the use of police and the term Islamists. In the last example, the Alexandria man is implied as a Muslim by indexing Egyptian in the title. Note that the Christians in these stories, who are also very likely Pakistani or Syrian or Egyptian, are not identified by nationality or race, but exclusively through religious identity and an assumed race of whiteness. So in conclusion, the construction of the masculinized Muslim subject as terrorist monster is repeated across immigration policy, official discourses, and the news media. According to a July 2017 Pew study, views about the link between Islam and violence have fluctuated over the last 15 years. In March 2002, 6 months after the 9/11 attacks, 51% of Americans said Islam does not encourage violence more than other faiths, while 25% said it does. Unsurprisingly, responses to this question have become substantially more divided along partisan lines. In 2002, Republicans and Democrats were separated by 11%. But in December 2016, the partisan gap has grown to 44 points, where 70% of Republicans say Islam is more likely than other religions to encourage violence. As this paper demonstrates, this imagined violence is perceived to be inflicted by Muslim men on white women and girls and Christians. This is why we unfortunately continue to see a rise in anti-Muslim hate crimes that disproportionately single out innocent Muslim men as they go about their lives, like the rest of us, but which the state, the media, and far too many Americans perceive as a threat to the rest of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shanila, for asking me to be part of this. This is well outside my usual beat, so I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity to learn. I'd like to start. I'd like to start by pointing to something that I don't know. It may have been pointed out in the morning, but that this has been, for me, a demonstration of how rigorous intellectual scholarship is its own mode of ethical politics. And I think that needs to be celebrated a little more than we usually do, that this is scholarship with a more urgent ethical imperative than it often is in many such academic environments. I had individual questions for each presenter, and then I thought I had somewhat inchoate thoughts on the panel as a whole. For Fatima Sidat, the question had to do with, I'm going to do this the other way. I'll do the general comments first, and then I'll do the individual comments. One of the things that struck me was I initially read the panel, the event description and the title, Muslim Masculinities, as automatically pointing to the diversity of masculinist paradigms in the Muslim majority world. And each paper seemed to reflect that promise in that it was located in a different empirical context. And yet, I'm struck by the extent to which we seem to have converged from all of those particularities into a somewhat, into a Muslim masculinity that, if not normative, I don't think it is normative, is still remarkably universalized across space, across time, and is essentially produced in discourse. And I'm wondering how and why that is the case. So, for instance, I know that in Persian and in Urdu and in Hindi, masculinity would translate as mardangi. I had questions about what's the word for masculinity in the different Arabics? What's the word for masculinity in Malay? And those are just examples I can think of off the top of my head. So a larger comment in terms of directions for future work was to be a little more aware of the manner in which we might, in our own ethical imperative to dismantle this discourse of the bright parts of the world, we might end up reproducing the analytical categories that they work with. We might end up with the Muslim male, and we might end up then facilitating the further circulation of that analytic. For Dr. Sidat, it was a remarkably rich exploration of the appropriation of Abbasid history to people fighting within ISIS, within Boko Haram. And it was a sort of Kafkaesque evocation of the way in which 21st century technology can magnify and I would argue distort the reinterpretation of original injunctions that emerged in a completely different world. The question that I had was, she spoke about the limited knowledge among ISIS fighters of Quranic injunctions, and I'm assuming, therefore, of the entire body of fiqh interpretations and reinterpretations as well, which led me to think about how one might flesh out that limited knowledge and the reasons for that limited knowledge a little more. So to reiterate something that I said as a general comment, how is it that Dr. Roos's Australians and soldiers, young men recruited from Uzbekistan and Morocco and India, how do they come to share, or do they share, one single model of ethics and one single model of masculinity? I had questions about lingua franca within ISIS. Is it Arabic? Who translates? How does everyday communication happen? So if you sign on to ISIS, are you then saying that you will learn Arabic willy-nilly because that's how people communicate? But then I have questions, given from what we know about the sociology and about stratification, particularly in the Persian Gulf states, what are the sociolinguistic hierarchies that get rearticulated within that world? I acknowledge that ethnography will be impossible. On the other hand, I wonder whether we're not even asking the question, so that the ISIS fighter ends up without a past. And if the ISIS fighter doesn't have a past, then he doesn't have a future either. So that was by way of one comment. A second comment was, particularly in the Islamic tradition, in the legal tradition, I would worry a little bit about the flattening out of the diversity of marriage practices. So what exactly is being reconstituted and remembered as marriage within, say, these new online portals, and what other kinds of practices then are disappearing from the discourse? And to what extent does that matter? For Dr. Roos, it was very interesting to see the kinds of questions and findings that ethnography could yield as opposed to the textual analysis of the other three papers. But precisely because the material was so rich, I had questions such as, how would we, and these are methodological questions, these are analytical questions, how would one establish the analytical and sociological priority of masculinity as the determining element in the formulation of this politics, as opposed to, say, ethnicity, nationality of origin, class. And I was thinking of a project that came out of the University of Washington some years ago called the Modern Girl Project, which actually brought people working on different regions of the world to try and examine why it is that in the early 20th century, you actually get convergences towards one kind of urbane, middle class, metropolitan girlhood. But then because they got so many people together, they were also able to identify where modern girls did not exist and how that might be explained. One of the comments about one of your slides. My Arabic is non-existent, but I read the Perso-Arabic script, and it struck me from my limited knowledge that it was terrible Arabic. It was, I think it said, Allah, Rasul, Muhammad. Yeah, but it didn't say that. So as a poster, I mean, it made no sense grammatically and syntactically. It just said Allah, Rasul, Muhammad. And it again echoed these questions about what kind of language and what kind of world in which linguistic incompetence doesn't matter. The other evidence question that I had for you was, you spoke about government initiatives in several parts of the Western world, in Europe and possibly in Australia, about empowering imams' councils, and you pointed out quite poignantly that these are young men already marginalized in their own communities. But then that raises questions about what other kinds of associations are there? Are there associations by region of origin? Are those demarcated along lines of religious community? What would a polity, a liberal democracy, multicultural democracy look like in which those kinds of associations were also actively encouraged by the state? Would that generate a plurality of Muslim masculinities instead of the kind of flattening out that imams' councils would produce? And then sort of cascading questions. Where do the imams come from? How do you get to be on the Australian Imams Council? For Natalie, again, method questions. I found your central formulation that what we're dealing with is how murder is framed, either as a typology of individual criminality or as in a sociocultural, in a racialized discourse of honor killing. I found that powerful precisely because it's such a simple, stark formulation. But then your presentation again opened up for me method questions about how we establish empirically the connections between discourse, the circulation of discourse, and the making of political communities. How would we identify communities that coalesce around shared interpretations of discourse or shared reception of discourse? You referred on numerous occasions to the international community. How do we identify membership in that international community as well as exclusions? And to me, those are crucial questions, especially because, as you argued at the end, in some ways, we're all trying to engage with how to construct alternative narratives, alternative discourses. And somewhat similar questions again for Mariam. For Mariam's paper especially, because I know about 5% more about Pakistan than I do about the rest of the Muslim majority world, it struck me that we are stuck with Breitbart and Muslim masculinity, rather than within Pakistan, what would Shia masculinity look different from Sunni masculinity? Where would the Ahmadis fit or not fit? On a different axis, what would Naqshbandi or Chishti masculinity look like as opposed to the masculinity of Punjabi Malangs? And so I'd like to end with that. Essentially, it's an argument for bringing back the particularity of Muslim life worlds in all their diversity, really as the first way of combating global discourses about the Muslim man. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll start with the question answers with the panelists.
And we'll start with Dr. C that is online already.
Okay, thank you very much for some of those questions. I think some of the questions for me went into the Australian section, so I'll leave those to Dr. Roos to pick up. In terms of the idea that there would be limited knowledge amongst the fighters, and that I'll take it straight into the sources that I used. The sources that I used were English language sources because they recruit primarily, they don't use English for recruiting. They recruiting in Arabic through videos and other social media, but they have published this magazine in English. And so this is what I used. I used an English language magazine for most of their discussion on slavery. And yeah, it's clear that they see, that there is a market for this, and they're speaking very particularly to English language speakers. And in that sense, I'm trying to think about your comment on what the ethical imperative here is, not to reproduce a problematic analytic. And I think that really is important. That we don't reproduce tropes of Muslim masculinity, which, the familiar dangerous Muslim man trope, that we don't reproduce that, the dangerous Muslim man, the imperiled Muslim woman, and then, of course, the savior, the third person in Shireen Razak's triangle of the savior. I think I'm also very careful not to reproduce that trope. What I was interested in this piece was writing about how the ways in which the kinds of masculinity that is produced in an Islamist project, in a militant Islamist project, how that masculinity claims to hail back to something original and authentic historically. But that if we look carefully, we see what is being produced is actually a very contemporary masculinity. And it is embedded in ideas of militarism and militancy, which almost fetish a past of militancy. They certainly fetish the sexuality of the militant. And I see that formulated through the production of the concubine. So it's almost as though a militant Muslim, or a Muslim who wants to be part of the caliphate and who believes in the caliphate, then is a Muslim who should, or a Muslim man, is then a Muslim man who should himself then be content or be expecting to be involved in this kind of a sexual relationship, or that this should be part of his reward, and that he should want it, be happy with it, and find ways to deal with it. Because you can also see in some of the narratives that the women tell about the kinds of obvious mental and psychological issues that the fighters themselves are facing as they engage in this relationship of concubinage, which I think for most, and a limit bit, but to say that this particular kind of sexual relationship, which is religiously sanctioned, so to speak, which is also somewhat aberrant and abnormal in the fighter's own home context. I think it breeds some sort of a dissonance. I think it's part of some sort of a dissonance. If you look at the idea that, if somebody is extremely religious or somebody's conservative, it's being told you shouldn't engage in sexuality outside of marriage. But then here's an alternative kind of sexuality, which is in concubinage. But concubinage is this very special thing that is exclusive to us as Muslims and exclusive to us as Muslim fighters. There's a whole lot, in my mind, there's a whole lot of emotional and intellectual and personal work you have to do to be able to become comfortable with that kind of a sexual relationship. So what I was interested in doing, firstly in the paper, was to show that what appears to be, or what is narrativized as a return to the history and a return to the text and a return to the tradition, is actually very modern. And it's modern for these very many reasons. So I struggled very much in writing this paper because I was afraid of reproducing a problematic analytic. And I mean, what I've done is presented a small excerpt of the broader paper, and I hope that I haven't, in that space, reproduced a problematic analytic. I think I haven't, and I'd be glad to hear if it appears that I have.
Thank you so much.
If that's
Dr.
sufficient, I'll stop
Sivas.
talking now.
Sorry for cutting you off. Can we have Dr. Roos answer? We are running a little short on time, and we'll move on to Dr. Roos now.
Okay, well, look, thank you for some excellent points. I'm going to take the horrendous headphones off, so I'm going to hope you can hear me. I'll merge the sort of points that you make into one response. The Australian Muslim communities are all well known for their exceptional diversity. We've got people from over 75 different countries speaking over 100 languages. We have every possible sectarian division, but also every possible sort of community gathering. So it's obviously difficult to, I take your point about masculinity being one of many potential influences, but it does come down to generations for me. The first generation, particularly in a multicultural context, come out, and multiculturalism is about claim making. Multiculturalism is about putting up your hand and saying, I represent a community, we would like some resources to build a community hall and so on. And that first generation came out and set up many different multicultural institutions. Some were Muslim oriented, some were ethnic oriented. What's happening though is that those communities, because Islam in Australia has really only been here en masse since the 1970s, are still dominated by the older generation of males. They're still dominated by a fixed group, a fixed power structure, which is almost impossible to penetrate. They're the ones who have the relationships for funding with politicians. They're the ones who have the relationship with the media and so on. So it's their voice that's heard. And so the second generation are far more multicultural. And in my fieldwork in the US, I found that many of the older generational divisions between, say, the African American and Arab communities were being healed and being sort of transformed by the younger generation, who see Islam as their primary identity marker rather than their ethnicity. So for me, what really emerged, and the reason I look at masculinity is that because in my own research, I've been immersed in this. I've grown up in this context. I grew up with Muslim friends and in a quite working class area. And, I saw how their sense of self after 9/11 was challenged. They were all of a sudden being pulled over by police. They were all of a sudden being treated differently. And you could see the impact that had on their sense of manhood, which in the Australian context is particularly important. So for them to see that and to actually witness it firsthand, it sort of led me down that research path. I can't give you a more articulate answer than that. The relationship of imams and government, it comes back to the politics of multiculturalism. The imams are almost certainly always born overseas. Very often countries such as Turkey would send out state-sponsored imams. We also have large Lebanese communities, and people would come out and have no immersion in local context. But and then they would form these boards, and then these boards would fight and dissolve, and a new board would be set up. So we have any number of Australian federations of Islamic councils. In our largest city of Sydney, I think there's 7 or 8 different representative bodies that claim they speak for Muslim communities. So really, and for young Muslims, there are many who put their hand up and say, I represent communities. There's no government aren't capable of engaging with whether or not they do, but they do give them money. So if you put your hand up and say, I'm going to come up with a de-radicalisation initiative for young Muslims, I need $60,000, the government most likely will fund it, or at least in recent history have funded that sort of thing. So imams councils really sort of only buy into and sort of make these problems worse, because they're not speaking for young people, they're not speaking for the concerns of the younger generation. I mean, and this will be my last point. If the Australian-born Muslim population, 70% of them are under the age of 20, only 10% of those young Muslims are going on to university, compared to the migrants who are coming in at a rate of about 25% of university graduates. So we're seeing a significant cleavage and a significant challenge facing young Australian-born Muslims. And to me, that's probably the single biggest challenge that a multicultural community like Australia faces.
Thank you, Dr. Roos. Is that working?
Oh, it's on now, sorry. Ramya, thank you so much for this question. I think it's a really excellent one. My previous research looked at transnational social movements, particularly in the queer Palestine movement. So there was a very specific small international community that I was looking at. And this new work is really looking discursively at these kind of shifting narratives across both national landscapes and also transnationally. So this is the piece I shared today is the current part of a 3-part project looking at adolescent masculinities. In the first example was Omar Khadr, and then this one, and then the next one is looking at the invisible history of Palestinian boys incarcerated in detention, particularly in juxtaposition to the spread of Ahed Tamimi's image in circulation. And I don't know a single name of a Palestinian boy who's been detained, though I know that the majority of them have been at some point. So, so I'm still grappling with these questions. Like, what is this international community? In 2014, it was Amnesty International and UN, and then celebrities. You know, like Penelope Cruz and Javier Bardem suddenly like spoke up, and then there was this like Hollywood scandal around people condemning the war and like battles internal to Hollywood. Meanwhile, we have the familiar actors of Palestine solidarity activists globally who are responding, but it brings up all of these new types of 2014 kind of divided also Jewish communities internationally who saw the deaths of children as something that was deplorable. So, I don't think I have a clear answer for who this international community is, other than it's something that as national narratives shift and change, and I'm kind of interested in that tempo and the pace of how those imagined senses of belonging or outrage or even attachment to human rights or internationalism emerge in particular kinds of moments. So in Omar Khadr's case, for example, I was interested in how Canada as a nation state was mobilized through a narrative in media and in kind of editorial responses to, Omar Khadr as a threat versus now he's this kind of sympathetic figure whose surgery we care about, like he has shoulder surgery, and it was a matter of news that he was okay. So how does that change so quickly? So these are excellent. It's an excellent question, and I will hopefully address it somehow in the future in the research. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. I think I'm going to first have to say humbly that I have done no work on Shia, Sunni, or MD masculinity, and so I can't really answer that question, or I don't feel qualified to answer that question. But I am going to talk a little bit about what you said about we're stuck with Breitbart, and we are stuck with this this anti-Muslim discourse that is very prevalent and popular across different institutions. So as I talked about with the state apparatus, with official discourses, and with the news media. And I think the reason that I'm emphasizing it obviously is because there is a sense of urgency in terms of how these kinds of this kind of speech circulates and the consequence of this kind of speech for people every day. And I think the other reason why it's really urgent for me is this analysis to some extent might be what people are already kind of know to some extent, right? Like that that there's something wrong with the way that these people are speaking on these issues. But I think the really important piece is under this, under the framing of free speech and the freedom of speech currently, there's a lot that gets passed as we shouldn't worry about it. It's kind of, just how people talk. Those people don't know any better. That's actually a really big problem. And I think the reason is because the way that language and discourse connects to these larger systemic structural processes is still a little bit kind of ambiguous or maybe disconnected, even for students that I teach, right? They still don't quite understand how this freedom of speech argument can be reconciled with civil rights discourse or human rights conversations. And I think that's part of what I'm trying to do with this work, and also then to emphasize the way that gender is co-constitutive with race when it comes to these kinds of marginalization processes and oppression that is taking place. And I also wanted to say something that struck out to me about Dr. Roos's presentation and the comment that was made about the seeming kind of linguistic incompetence of some of these Islamist fighters. And again, this is not necessarily my area of focus, but what was interesting about that is that actually what is typically considered competence in Arabic speaking is irrelevant, because what's happening here is that the script is serving as a kind of symbolic sign or iconic of a certain Muslim ummah. And so for that reason, it's almost irrelevant that it doesn't follow certain syntactic or grammatical rules, but actually it is it's being reformulated. And I'm sure, based on my research with Pakistani origin youth who are very often mixing what we would typically refer to as Urdu or English or Arabic, they're actually formulating their own kind of registers, which are organized around their youth practices. And so I wouldn't be surprised if Islamist youth fighters are doing a similar move where Arabic is being instrumentalized because it offers a certain kind of symbolic significance, but then there's all this other things that they're doing, as we know, for example, on social media and et cetera. So I just thought that was an interesting comment, and I wanted to expand on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the insightful presentations. We don't have time for audience questions. We can take that. So probably take 2 questions. Thank you. Shanila to thank for that.
Thank you so much for these wonderful presentations. And actually, I have so many questions, but I'll limit myself to 2. And the first one is actually, I wonder how this whole discussion is fundamentally about the link that exists in every society between masculinity and violence. And how, when it becomes an excess, we start talking about it like in the context of ISIS, where it becomes very horrific. Or we want to distance ourselves from violence, so we project that on the other, and so on. So I wonder, how do we conceptualize that? Because to my mind, there is a very specific history as well, established relationship between masculinity and violence that's not limited to Islam, not limited to ISIS, but actually much broader than that. And when do we start seeing it as an excess? And the other point that I thought was really interesting and somehow connected all the papers together was this cult of innocence. And who do we constitute as innocent, and who deserves sympathy, and who deserves protection, and who is not? And how, in the process, we create this dichotomy between the good versus bad Muslim, the man who does not deserve any sympathy just because he's a man, he's guilty and not innocent, versus other groups. So I thought there is actually a very interesting discourse there that's very powerful and that has been shaping, and mind you, not only in the West, but even in the context of the Middle East, where, to show any sympathy to what's happening in Syria, you have to say women and children were the victims, but not men. Anyway, I will not say more, but I thought there was an interesting link there that I would love to hear a bit more of your thoughts. But you said some really great things that I think we should pursue those maybe later.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask about, with regard to the question of sex slaves and concubines, you spoke a bit about the pushback from others about issues of consent and mutuality. And, what was so disturbing and striking about the discourses in the Beak was how sexuality was discussed as this very unidirectional thing. It's something that the men get from the women, and there's no sense of mutuality. So I wanted to ask if there is ever in what you read in their materials a sense of sexuality as something mutual rather than just going in one direction. And then speaking about the 2014 Gaza campaign and the discourses around it and the question of memory, that moment seemed very striking in that so many people who might have kept quiet before about Palestinian rights did speak up because of this issue, especially of attacks on children. But in recent months or within the last month, a few people have lost positions or jobs because of tweets that they sent out at that time. I know there was someone who was supposed to be a model for CoverGirl or something who lost her contract, and I think the person who won the Great British Bake Off also received some pushback for tweets she had tweeted at that time that now are being posited as anti-Semitic. So I just was wondering about even memory within a few years and how that kind of changes our perspective on it. Thank you.
And there was a question at the back, right? Yeah. Sorry about that.
I actually missed some part of the discussion, so please forgive me if I say something that's already been discussed. So I was just noting on the idea of limited knowledge, I was thinking, to me, the limited knowledge of the ISIS soldier about Islam and fiqh and things like that is just as surprising as the limited knowledge of the American soldier in Iraq and Afghanistan about the tenets of democracy and nationalism. It doesn't surprise me beyond that. And Allah Rasul Muhammad for me is actually, for the Islamic community, a very universally, very powerful trope for uniting things in the same way, democracy, liberty, and freedom, or whatever those things are. That was in the recent history. And I was having the feeling that in this entire discussion, we are kind of slipping into a position where the ideological discourse of the ISIS is extremely successful. That's why we're discussing it. And I myself, when I looked at the magazines published by Al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula, one of the most surprising things that surprises me to this day was this section called Words from Friends and Foes. And it had quotations from various political personalities and intellectuals. And amongst various other things, you had quotations from Noam Chomsky and Slavoj Žižek. And what struck me was how successfully they've managed to take in the critique of media and democracy from Chomsky and the general crisis of modernity that Zizek talks about, amongst other things, and really offered young Muslim youth a very coherent and powerful kind of response to that. And I think any kind of effort to dismantle this ideological apparatus that we're so clearly against is also understanding what makes it so successful and powerful and not ignoring the power and the tremendous success that it's had. So that's all.
The last question.
Thank you. Oh, I really appreciate that. Okay, excellent. I'd love to ask you all questions, but this is a question for Mariam. I was thinking while you were putting the examples from Breitbart up on the screen about how masculine Breitbart is as a media source, how it's used as a tool to educate young white conservative men about what masculinity should be. And I just thought and it's part of, in the way that it's part of a wider repertoire, right? That education talking about the violent Muslim man is part of this wider repertoire of political ideas and almost aesthetics for a white conservative man that includes opposition to PC culture, includes opposition to Black Lives Matter. And in fact, often I think a lot of those titles are intentionally controversial, intentionally kind of in your face, for lack of a better phrase, in order to emphasize indirectly the role that that type of speech has in a white conservative masculinity. So what I thought would, and I certainly don't want you to start thinking, I don't want you to shift thinking about white conservative masculinity, but I thought, I'd love to hear you reflect on the ways that thinking about how white conservative masculinity is so dependent on a certain version of Muslim masculinity that is violent, that has a specific attitude to women, for instance, can kind of just even deepen or make even richer your analysis, because Breitbart itself is a tool for teaching masculinity to a certain group.
I think we have the questions, and I'm going to leave.
Sure. Farah, I think that was, more of an intervention. That was excellent observation of what's going on. So I don't think, other than I agree, and I want to continue the conversation. And Sadaf, right? Thank you for that. I think one of the things that we're seeing today is an interesting way in which it's not even so much memory as much as it is the traces and hauntings of what social media provide for capacity to mine data from people's profiles and then construct a narrative that is evacuated from a historic context. So 2014 is evacuated from its actual larger social responses, and also the affective feel of what's going on at the time when we just pick apart and pull at one piece. And I'm actually not even familiar with the two examples you gave me, but it's this is a social media scary zone. I'm sure many people in academia have thought about this, your web presence and the history and what that looks like for changing times. I'll just leave it at that.
So those are really interesting questions, and I actually wanted to kind of bridge those two, because so your question, you were commenting on how masculinity and violence have this kind of relationship across societies and across time, and when does it become excessive? And what's interesting in thinking about that question in relationship to how you were talking about Breitbart is that, in a sense, Breitbart's explicit discourse is this first order Muslim masculinity as excessive, right? As this kind of, as this trope that they can use and position white femininity as victimized by it, and then also Christendom to an extent, right? The way it's phrased is as if it was actually this clash, right? That is, 2,000 years old. So then the second way of looking at that is that the excessiveness of Muslim masculinity as it's presented on Breitbart is the first order, and the second order is this excessiveness of white conservative voices who position Muslim masculinity as doing violence to their community, and therefore they must respond with an even more kind of excessive response, which is then echoed across institutions, right? And so there's this first order of a depiction or imagined violence and masculinity, and then there's this second order response, which is actually being echoed across institutions. So that's an interesting way, I think, and I don't think it's in any sense not privileging what is being discussed today, but in a sense gives a kind of meta-level kind of perspective on why this kind of a symposium is so necessary, and also how these processes are actually unfolding. Because I think part of it is there's an assumption that we understand what's happening, but there's actually many layers to this that are not immediately visible. And so how can we address that? So that was actually really helpful 2 questions for me to think about what to do with this paper. Thank you so much.
Would you like to add something to it, Dr. Seebert? Dr. Roos, we still have about 5 minutes. Okay, we're done. We'll take a short 10-minute break, and we'll come back here for a discussion and remarks by Dr. Jamal Elias. And I'd request all the panelists to be back on the stage after the break. And thank you so much. Thank you.
People have been using it because they can't wait for the remarks to wait.
It'd be good to continue the conversation. Are you under the